Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm a game artist. This is a talk I gave at BAF Game 2012, which is part of the Bradford Animation Festival. It happened about a month ago in November. Thought I better record it, put it up. So I'm going to try and go through this quickly. This is a talk about sort of art direction in games, but I called it game art style because that's how gamers talk about it these days, as you can see in this Penny Arcade comic. But that wasn't always the case. When I was a kid playing video games in the 80s, we would talk about graphics. When my friends and I were talking about what games we were playing, it was all about, are the graphics cool? And that's what ads would talk about. This is the famous Donkey King. It had 4 full graphics screens, realistic graphics. SNES had power graphics. And we don't say that anymore, we say style. And I think that gamers now, they understand the difference between what was this weird conflation of game engines and art and the word graphics. And now they understand the difference between engine and art style. So players think style is important. It's sometimes hard to grasp why. To me, it's sort of like a great song. There's lots of different ways to make sound, to layer it together, but that doesn't make a song. Style is sort of a recipe for bringing sounds together in a way that makes a great song, make music. And I thought about showing a clip of, like a symphony or something here. Then I remembered this clip from Hustle and Flow. I think you'll have to click through to the actual video so I don't double encode it here, but go check it out and come back. And whether you like this music or not, it has massive amounts of style. And in a way, game art comes together the same way as freestyle hip-hop. Got all these different elements that are sort of layered together on the fly to create a composition. I think it's interesting to look at games that have a long lineage that existed in every console generation, like Mario and Metal Gear. The artists making these games were up against huge technical constraints. They had like a 16 pixel block and they had to make it look like a guy. And it's really hard to do. It's just that. Forget about style for a second. Pixel Mario here has thumbs, which is a major achievement for that artist. It was kind of like painting a canvas with Lego. And you can see how these games sort of evolved through the generations. And as those technical constraints started to change, in some cases go away, they developed their own style. And today they're very different. And we almost had a little bit of a genre split at the 3D. We've got 2D Marios today, and some 2D stealth games that are sort of carrying the torch for Metal Gear. I think this shows how much styles opened up with modern hardware and game engines. Today there's a huge style landscape available. And my favorite way to map that landscape is with something from Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comic. And I call this the style triangle. I can't remember which he calls it, but he uses it to map the style of different comics. In the bottom left corner, he's got reality. So in a photo of a face. The top is abstraction and the bottom right's meaning. And for comics, he's got text there as well as images because comics layer text and images. So let's break this down a little bit. In the bottom left, reality, so a photo of the face. In the top, abstraction. This is from our Penny Arcade comic at the beginning. And in the bottom right, meaning. He makes the point in the book that you can draw 2 dots in a line and show it to pretty much anybody from any culture in the world, and they'll say that's a face. It's sort of a pure meaning drawing. So I love this triangle. You can take anything visual and plot it on here, including games. For a quick example, let's look at racing games, starting with realism. Luckily, racing games don't have to worry about the uncanny valley, so you can get way down in that corner. You might have something like Forza, which aims to have a real racing experience. At the top, you might have something like Rez or maybe Wipeout, which is about feeling of speed or exploration. On the bottom right, I've got Line Rider, which is really just about the shape of that line, and traversal, pure mechanics. Revisiting our history for a second, if you take our Mario and Metal Gear thing and you flip it, it kind of maps like this. In earlier generations, you were kind of limited to the right side. Things have opened up with modern hardware and game engine. And I think it's probably pretty good that Mario stopped where it was, or things might have gotten a little weird if it went too far down to the bottom left. So I want to talk a little bit about Uncanny Valley. Lots of folks are very keen on getting down into reality corner over here. So why is that? What is the attraction? A lot of people think that this is the only way to raise sort of the experience, to elevate it, to make it the highest quality, to immerse players more. We see a lot of trailers for video games nowadays that are either live action or pre-rendered to look highly realistic, but we don't see that same thing when we play the game. And you could actually shoot things in live action and play them in the game if you wanted to. But we work very hard as game developers to try and smooth out that dissonance between the storytelling bits and the gameplay bits. We want the whole thing to work as one single experience. And the problem starts because if you try and take gameplay all the way down into reality corner, it doesn't work. And gameplay is sort of fundamentally abstract. Like if you made a game that was a full simulation of reality in every detail, it wouldn't be a game, it would be real life. So gameplay actually requires a level of abstraction to be fun. And this is not a conflict that's going to disappear with new graphics hardware or better game engines. Gameplay will always be a stylized version of reality. So we need to consider art style in that context. Because game artists, we talk about this all the time. People might say, oh, the next game engine's coming, Unreal Engine 4 is coming, we're going to solve this. Games are going to have characters that are as expressive, believable as Gollum or Avatar. Well, for one thing, those are stylized characters. They're not realistic humans, but I often agree with these people. I agree, and we're going to have characters that are totally believable and realistic. And there are games that are carrying that torch and doing a great job, like Heavy Rain and LA Noire. But there's always a challenge there, and that's that inevitably the player is going to take control, and there's going to be a seam. And some of the best games coming out these days and work very hard to smooth out those seams. And every game does it a little differently. But this is not something that's going to go away with a new console generation. Narrative and gameplay are strange bedfellows. So this is why style is so important to games. Style allows us as game artists to craft an abstract reality, an internally meaningful reality, that if we deliver it with a consistent, steady hand, will lull that player into the magical realm of believability. This is suspension of disbelief. This is the illusion of life. It's that state of mind where it all feels real. And when it feels real, you get experiences like this clip. It's called Immersion's short film. I'm going to link to it in the YouTube. Go check it out. It is super worth your time. Now, as game developers, we create this impression by aligning gameplay and art style. They've got to be doing the same thing, going to the same place. Gameplay and art style working together. Now, this brings us back to the triangle. You can use the triangle. It's a fantastic tool for thinking about your game style, your gameplay. You can plot your gameplay experience in the triangle and use that as a guidepost for your art style. Is your game a deep simulation, like Skyrim? Is it crisp fun, like Triple Town? Or is it abstract exploration, like Rez? Your art style must align to that gameplay. And coming up in the next part, I'm going to talk about how you can specifically develop an art style. So this is part 2 to my talk about game art style, art direction in games. So I was just talking about the style triangle. It'll put up some fences and make sure you're playing in the right ballpark, but artists need to make specific choices. And to get started making specific, stylish game art, a wonderful place to start is inspiration. Reference points. And since we've learned that games have a relatively short history of style, and for a lot of that time it's been heavily technically constrained, it's a great idea to broaden your search for inspiration and look at other media. Now I'm going to tell you how to be inspired. That's going to be up to you to find what you think is beautiful. And as artists, we sort of do this naturally. But instead, I want to talk about what you can't borrow from other media. Hopefully by understanding that, you'll find interesting new ideas that are a great fit for games. And of course, this is all my opinion, my take on this. So let's start with film and photography. When we look at a film as a source of inspiration, I think it's most important to pay attention to the cinematography. If you look at the roles of people on a film, the director, that's the player. The actors, they're either going to be other players, and so they're going to look dumb, or they're going to be AI, and they're going to look dumb. They're never going to approach the performance level in gameplay of Hollywood movie. But the photographic look of a film, as developed by the director of photography, is fantastic reference. But you can't copy the photographic look of a film wholesale. With film, once you've got a good lens on your camera, you set your exposure, you've lit the set, you get a massive amount of stuff for free that graphics programmers and games have to try and painstakingly recreate. Game engines have to make this all up from scratch and render it 30 times a second. For example, in the last generation, a lot of art directors wanted the look of Saving Private Ryan, which was a bleach bypass technique, and a lot of programmers spent a lot of time recreating that look. But with a film, all you had to do is bypass the bleach. And the same thing goes for atmospheric perspective, bloom, ambient occlusion, bounce lighting, dynamic vegetation, on and on and on. Generally speaking, the whole beautiful complexity of nature, cameras get that for free, and games have to work to replicate it in painstaking simulated detail. Same goes for set design and costume design. There's great work in film to be referenced, but that natural complexity of real materials and locations is basically impossible to replicate in perfect detail in a game. So keep that in mind the next time you hear game artists say they want their game to look like, say, Kingdom of Heaven. Unless that game artist has infinite programmers and infinite time, they're not gonna get it all. They're gonna have to make some hard choices. And by making those choices, they're defining a style. If we look at 3D animation, there's a ton of beautiful 3D animation work out there, and a lot of it uses manufactured 3D worlds, just like games. People have to build this stuff from scratch. The artists and the technical folks on these films are doing what game programmers and artists are doing, coming up with tricks and hacks to expressively reflect the beauty of the real world. But games can't do everything 3D animation can. Usually when there's a beautiful new effect in a film, it's based on new technology that takes hours to render a single frame, but there's all these techniques. Fur and hair subsurface scattering, advanced lighting and compositing. Games are always going to be cheapening these effects or waiting until the hardware catches up. There are some victories. We've got subsurface scattering on Jack's ear on the left and subsurface scattering in The Last of Us. Our version's a little less powerful, but we have ways of working around it. Illustration is perhaps the richest vein of inspiration to explore. There's so much beautiful work and so much stylistic variety to be found. But you've got to look with a critical eye. This is a beautiful painting by Tom Scholes, one of my favorite artists. But if you were to look at this and try and build a game around it, what you're getting from this is tone. It's a feeling, some shape language, but not much beyond that. You can't build a game environment to look like this. So much of illustration is about composition, using compositional tricks to draw your eye around the image, liberally spicing with atmospheric perspective, softening edges wherever you need to, hardening them in other places, removing detail where it's not needed. Things you can't do really on the fly in a dynamic environment where the player is holding the camera and the player is determining the composition. So if you take an illustrator's inspiration, you sure wouldn't know what elements you can actually put into a game. Here we have shadows, black shadows hiding things for the sake of composition. If you put this stuff in a game under game lights, give the camera to the player, the magic of that illustration might be completely lost. Valve understood this when they did, we missed something here. There's a presentation out there about the art direction for Team Fortress 2 and how they referenced J.C. Leyendecker and other illustrators and adapted that look to their games. They took what worked and they developed their own look around it, and that's what you have to do. It's worth mentioning that 2D games, because you've got this big background canvas to work with, can do a lot more. The camera is not fixed, but it's a lot more fixed than it is in 3D games. Take the opportunity in a 2D game to paint a beautiful canvas. Drawn animation is sort of illustration in motion, and it has a lot of the disadvantages I just described from illustration, and even worse, the game version of drawn animation often lacks that illusion of life that comes from the animator's hand. Just today, somebody mentioned in a YouTube video how he was inspired by John Kay, the guy behind Ren and Stimpy. And John Kay had said, "I never draw a face the same way twice," and that was sort of how he got power of expression through his hand into those characters. Of course, that's the opposite of what we do in video games. The other thing is, in a game, the animator's hand has to be subject to the player's hand on the controller. I had a video here, must be gone, I'll have to link to it. You've got a punch animation, there's not going to be any anticipation on that punch. It's got to hit right after the player presses the button. And outlining characters and environments can be problematic too. There are specific games like Mark of the Ninja where drawn animation works, but usually it's because the whole game is really designed around evoking that style of hand animation. In order to create great art for a video game, you've got to understand what's going to look good in the game engine, what's going to look good in the hands of the player. That's the trick. Nothing from these other media will look good in a game if you borrow the style wholesale. Instead, look at this stuff and do look at it, but look at it through the lenses of game art. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next part. So we're talking about how I like to look at inspiration and reference in other video games too, and interpret what's working, what's not. In a way, making art is filtering, taking in, and regurgitating. And that's not a particularly appetizing way of describing the artistic process. So I've borrowed Jesse Schell's lenses wording instead, but take your pick. If you take any of these artistic media I've shown up here, film, comics, games, you can break them down into stylistic elements, which is sort of what I've half-assedly tried to do here. And I'm not talking about how movies are made or how games are made. I'm talking about when you see that final image on the screen, what do you see? What are the elements on the screen that make up the style? Games have some overlap, but they break down differently from other media. For example, in comics and film, the composition or the layout or staging is of critical importance. This is why storyboards are such a powerful tool. But with games, that element of composition is almost always under the player's control because they wield the camera. And so we can't consider it a dominant stylistic element for games. So let's look at what is important for games. The way modeling or sculpting affects the final rendered frame is only in two specific ways: the silhouette of objects or cast shadows that are created by those objects. Game artists often have a choice about whether to model something like a brick or paint it into a texture, and the difference is in silhouette and shadow. Kinds of shapes that show up in silhouettes and shadows have a big impact on style. Look at Mario Galaxy again. Pretty much everything is round, but also squashed and stretched most of the time, as if the geometry is pliable or rubbery. Look at Gears of War. There are lots of rectangular forms, softened at the top corners, with chips missing, like weathered bricks. And the same goes for the characters. Game characters need especially strong silhouettes because you're often judging them at a distance, under time pressure from gameplay. Good guy, bad guy, what's this character about? What's his story? Try and pick that out from a silhouette that's 20 pixels high. Game artists and game concept artists spend a lot of time on character silhouettes. When it comes to texturing, it breaks down into two specific things. The textures on objects give them color and define how detailed they appear in the final rendered frame. Color first. Color is extremely powerful in setting a tone. I think this is one area where we can do a lot better as game developers. It gets challenging when you've got a lot of different artists coming together to make a game, and when you're reusing objects all over the place. Yet, when a game comes out with a deliberate, carefully considered color palette, it's perhaps the most important stylistic element. And to revisit our history, in the NES days, the hardware also enforced limited color palettes. And in many ways, this was an aesthetic strength. In my opinion, it's where a lot of the retro appeal for these games comes from. You can see evidence in this in the ability to nearly eliminate the pattern of the pixel art and still remain with recognizable characters, purely based on palette arrangement. Another example is the demake experiments that have been popular recently, where you take a modern game, reimagine it as they might have been in an early console like the NES. The modern games with strong color choices are the ones that make for great pixel art. This is the color palette for Team Fortress 2. It's got a strong color palette, makes for a great demake. I'm talking about detail. Detail is of special consideration in games because players direct themselves. We don't have that compositional tool I was talking about before to direct the player's eye. So we can use detail or the lack of detail as a surrogate. A lot of artists will go and try and detail everything in the game world, so if the player walks up to it, it looks like there's something realistic feeling there. But sometimes that works to a disadvantage because it's not interactive and it's not important. I worked in MMOs for a long time, and I remember when EverQuest 2 was coming out. World of Warcraft was coming out around the same time. And EverQuest 2 and MMO developers like myself, we ran up against this. There's so much going on in an MMO. We just were heavily constrained on what we could push as far as detail. On EQ2, the artist sliced up the outfits and put tiling textures across them to get more and more detail out of it. And WoW sort of took the opposite approach. They sort of embraced the fact that their textures were going to be blurry and used their studio art style and came up with something that works for their game. Now, if you walk up to a brick wall in one of these games and you take a screenshot of it, EverQuest 2 might look a little bit better. But when you consider the experience as a whole, and WoW, you stop looking at individual bricks, you take in the whole world as one. And I think it works to their advantage. Can deliver a style consistently, it becomes its own internal reality. It casts a magic spell on you. Here is color and detail together. This is Kazuo Oga. He's a background painter on many of the Studio Ghibli films. And his whole job is to paint the stuff that you're not supposed to pay pure attention to. Let the characters in the story sit on top of it. And so he uses color and selective detail to suggest texture. Look at this rock. It's brush strokes, but it suggests the texture of a rock. Compare this rock in Crisis. It's got lots of detail, but which rock is better for your game? Now, if you combine silhouette with color, this is Dermot Power's amazing concept art, which is essentially shapes and colors. It's silhouette and color. There's not a lot of lighting, there's not a lot of detail, there's suggested detail. But he comes up with incredible character designs this way and he's drawing what's most important to the character design and leaving the rest out. Lighting is creating areas of light and shadow to create contrast, draw the eye. And it's one of the things that's actually pretty much the same across all media. I read this book, Painting with Light by John Alton, recently, and it predates video games, but everything in it is totally applicable. Shading is how surfaces react to lighting. The best example I could think of how this plays a role in style is Battlefield games, of which I'm a massive fan. Here you've got Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield 3. The shapes on the characters are pretty similar. The color palette is pretty similar. The lighting is improved, but the major differences in my mind are in shading. There's ambient occlusion shaders, atmosphere, Fresnel on the cloth, and lots of other things that get technical, but when programmers are developing these things and developing the look, artists play a big role in defining that look through shading. The fundamental challenge of animation in games is that the player wants to press a button and see an action result immediately. Problem with anticipation not being there, momentum. You run around with a character in a game, you change directions, they snap to the new direction because you as a player need that, but it doesn't have momentum and weight. One thing that we do better in games every year is use simulation and AI to build better procedural animations. Blending of IK, leaning, parametric animation, behavior graphs to drive the animations and the transitions, physics. And stuff feels good to the player because it's honest and it's natural in the game world. Backbreaker sort of took this to an extreme for football. And Tsunomori Dreams takes it about as far as you can go.
Do anything. Why are you putting the mouse?
You know what? I'm not going to play their video in here. I'm going to link to it. Go check out the Yogcast. The entire physical nature of the movement in the game is simulated. There's no keyframed motion or motion capture. Notice the characters are getting more and more stylized as we go. You might say that this game has no art style, or that the programmer art hurts it, but I think that the animation is so authentic feeling because of all the technical work that went into it. It's actually incredibly stylish. Exposure is a relatively new thing in video games as we get better and better at simulating cameras, but it's very important. Earlier I said that pixel art was like painting a canvas with Legos. Well, building a game world these days in 3D games, sort of like building a little diorama world from scratch and then photographing it. This is the work of Kim Kiever, where she does exactly that in fish tanks and injects atmosphere, photographs it, and I think it's a great analog to what we do as world builders in video games. Also, like photography and like real cameras, there are bad cameras and there are good cameras. And there's things like, there's a lot of technical stuff that goes into having a good camera in your game. Also, like photography, there's work to be done on the image that comes from the camera to make it look its best. In some cases, added layer stylization, film treatment, exposure correction, post effects, and color grading. And to me, all these aspects of exposure are about creating a feeling or a tone. To me, we do that by simulating the eye. And my best way of explaining this is to think about the sun. Sunlight is warm on your face. If you stare at the sun, it physically hurts your eye. And there are photographic tricks that have sort of come through with cameras like lens flares and things like that, and bloom, that help remind us of that feeling that we get from a real eyeball. Another example is when you go outside in the moonlight and you look around, you get a sense that it's blue. Well, moonlight isn't blue. The moon is gray. The sun is sort of yellow. The light coming off the moon is not so strongly blue. It's not blue at all, I don't think. I might be corrected on this. What I remember is that the way that your eyes perceive low light lends you to believe that moonlight is blue. So we go and we color grade night shots to be blue. In video games, we try and fake all this stuff to create the right feeling and the right tone. If you put all these elements together, you have a style. Now, if you were to draw some conclusions from all this, it's that game art is nothing special without that real-time rendering technology that enables it, or the gameplay that makes it matter. It can get depressing as a game artist sometimes to get a sense for all these constraints. And, basically this whole presentation is just me bitching about all the things I'm not allowed to do as a game artist. All the cool ideas get ruined by, technology and players. But of course, the reality is that interactivity is what makes game art great. Everything I've said so far is theory. In practice, when you set out to make a game, you don't have your technology, you don't have your gameplay, the final gameplay. Game development is a process of discovery. And at Bethesda Game Studios, we have this saying, great games are played, not made. And that means you can talk and design in the air all you want, but you don't know anything about what your game is going to be until you play it. So it'd be a mistake to sit down and paint a bunch of concept art and say, this is the art style for our game, and be done. Just by building gameplay and technology, art styles need to be discovered through iteration, trial, and error. Here's some great examples of early screenshots for landmark, beautiful games and how they turned out. It's pretty rare to see these kinds of screenshots released, but it's not so rare to go through this when you're making a game. Games are supremely malleable. In theory, you could change the main character of your game, the entire look of them, the entire character design, on the last day of development. You could swap them out. Everything would still work. There's no other media where you could do that in the last 1% or less of making something. But you can't get great art direction through pure random experimentation. Everything I've been talking about is how you should be planning for a strong art. Often artists will just say our game's going to be incredibly realistic, or stylized, or God forbid, cel-shaded, and that's just a recipe for blandness at best. You should make something bold and stylish and make it work by aligning the art style with great gameplay and technology. So I talked about pixels, triangles of style, landscapes of inspiration, lenses of game art, and I want to finish up with some vector plots of art direction. There are a lot of artists working on the average game, and it's to everyone's benefit to get those artists thinking expressively, being creative. You won't get any art style. You reduce art production to a mechanical pipeline. But on the other hand, you've got to get those artists working together. Without consistency in the art, you don't have a style. So here's how I think about it. It's like each artist is a vector. If they're all going in different directions, they sum to nothing. But if you can get them oriented, which is difficult given the sort of intangible, touchy-feely nature of artistic expression, but if you can do it, those vectors will sum to a strong single force. These vectors are what I see in my head when I hear the term art direction. If you can get everything in your game sharing a style, and that style vector aligns with your gameplay vector and your technology vector, then you've created a world, an internally consistent reality that allows players to immerse themselves, and that is going to make for an amazing experience. And so that's the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.